Right guys, so in this video we're going to spend a bit of time talking about coaching the squat and the different moving parts or variables that come in performing this exercise. So as a personal trainer, this is an exercise you're undoubtedly going to be coaching hundreds if not thousands of times throughout your career. And what you're going to find is that different individuals will present with different problems or things that you have to correct them on. So as a result, the purpose of this video is not to guide you on how to create the perfect squat, because if you know, as a trainee, when you were initially training before you became a personal trainer, if you are a trainer listening to this, what you might have thought was that, all of your exercise adjustments and, technique cues or whatever, they were all dedicated towards improving your squat. However, as a trainer or someone who's helping others, you actually have to have a much more diverse toolbox of cues, along with the ability to actually recognize different problems or different flaws or different things you might want to correct if you're going to be working with hundreds if not thousands of individuals. So that is one of the things that does differ between trying to improve your own squat and trying to help another person improve theirs. So what we're going to do here is basically work through the squat systematically, looking at the different joints that are involved and then trying to get an appreciation for what you might see between different clients and how you might start to correct those things or guide your client towards a technique that might be a little bit more desirable. Okay, so not all of these things need to be fixed or need to be addressed, but in some cases that might be necessary. So you might see that someone has a little bit of a technique deviation that you're not too sure about, but they've been doing it for 10 years and they've never had any issues, and in that case you mightn't even want to correct it. But if you're coaching someone new and they present with that same deviation and you have the option to actually adjust it now early on in their training career, that might be the case for actually trying to intervene here and give some specific cues. So Paddy's here in the squat rack, guys, and first things first, what we're thinking about here when we're setting up this squat for our clients is obviously we're thinking about the position of the actual J hooks. So we want it to be set at an appropriate height for them to be able to lift the weight off. Okay, relatively basic thing most of you will be aware of, but still worth considering. Now, the thing that is more variable between individuals and that you will undoubtedly have thought about before is where you actually put your hands. Okay, and as a kind of rule of thumb, what I like people to do is put their hands as close as is comfortable. Okay, and by comfortable I don't just mean the absence of pain or whatever. I mean the closest they can get that allows them to put the bar where they want to put it. So that might differ between a high bar squatter and a low bar squatter. So if someone has the bar in a different position on their back, that changes the demands at the shoulder and hence changes the point at which we will grip the bar. But for a lot of people, I'm going to have that somewhere around kind of just outside shoulder width, maybe a couple of inches out, so that they can actually grab the bar comfortably and get it on their back. What you don't want is for someone when they're first learning the squat to really have to strain to get under the bar. So make sure it starts off nice and comfortable. Okay, so as Paddy then gets under the bar, I want to point out a couple of things. So what you're going to be thinking about here when you're thinking about the bar position on the back is, like, one, you can start to think about how the individual actually squats. So if you're working with someone, who is squatting for powerlifting, you might have to be thinking about what allows them to move the maximum amount of weight. So if you're working with that individual and they're trying to maximize their strength, sometimes they might opt for a low bar type position, which is going to allow a lot of people at least to shift a little bit more weight, versus maybe a really high bar position like Paddy has here for someone who's maybe trying to stay a little bit more upright and try to train the quads. So that's going to vary a little bit between individuals, and in general I'm not going to be cueing a trainee on their first day to go as low as they possibly can. I'm going to say, let's find a comfortable point on your back. In general, I'm going to look for kind of the spine of the scapula, or basically the part of their traps that allows me to actually place the bar in there, and somewhere that's quite comfortable for them. Okay, so if you're dealing with individuals who have lower levels of body fat and lower levels of muscle mass, they're going to find certain positions less comfortable because the spine of the scapula and potentially their spinous processes of the vertebra, they're going to be sticking out, and those bony prominences, when they become in contact with the bar, that can be uncomfortable for those individuals. This is also really important to keep in mind when you are working with elderly individuals or individuals who are a little bit more kyphotic in terms of their posture. So if someone is hunched over, like Paddy is there now, and they have lower levels of muscle mass, particularly in elderly individuals, they're going to have more prominent spinous processes, and hence it might be a little bit less comfortable for them to actually hold that bar. So in those cases, that's really where we want to emphasize trying to retract the scapula, pinch the shoulder blades back, keeping the chest up, and then finding that meaty area where they can actually begin to rest down the bar. Now, if someone was having a lot of discomfort here and it was like, making them not want to squat at all, I might consider putting an extra layer between the bar and their back, whether that be the use of a pad or even just a towel, or potentially using something like a safety bar. But for the purposes of this, let's just start as we are. So Paddy's found his nice comfortable position for the bar. What we're looking at then is his hand position. So are they even either side? Okay, I'm checking the center. I'm seeing, is the bar center on his back? Yes, it is. Are the hands even either side? Yes, they are. Perfect. And then what I'm looking for is that those wrists are in a nice strong position. So what I want to show you here quickly is Paddy letting his wrist fall back. So what he's doing there, the wrists are falling back. And especially if you're in a low bar type of squat, what you're going to find is that you're now dealing with all of this weight, which could be 50, 100, 150, 200 kilos even. If that's resting back in your wrist, that can start to lead to a little bit of elbow discomfort. And this is something you'll find in a lot of if you're working with strength athletes, you will find that this is a common complaint, elbow pain during the squat, because of those demands at the wrist when they have to grab the bar. So what we don't want is for the elbow to be a limiting factor during the squat. So if I was presented with an individual who was having that experience, one, I would try to cue them to keep the knuckles up towards the ceiling to create that strong wrist position, because now we've got force transfer from this bar straight down through the actual line of his arm, rather than being directed back through the wrist. So we've taken some of that strain off the wrist flexors and hence off that medial epicondyle where those wrist flexors actually attach. Now, there are other things you can do, such as what Paddy's doing here. He's alternating his thumb back and forth. So if you can keep the thumb over the bar, generally that can be quite a nice way of doing things in terms of keeping the bar in place. And sometimes you can even opt to not even hold the whole bar. If you bring your hands, like Paddy's just using his fingers there, he's just using to support. That's particularly useful for those individuals who have really poor shoulder mobility. Some people who might have been, bodybuilding for years, and they've always just been doing bench presses and stuff like that, and they've never really worked those ranges of motion. They might find themselves feeling a little bit more limited in terms of external rotation, and they might have to go wider and just use their fingers. But another thing that can be quite useful, particularly for those kind of low bar squatters, is if you bring your hands in again for me, Paddy, and rather than resting it across that kind of line here, bring your hands up another bit. Exactly. So what Paddy's doing here now is he's just barely using that base of his palm to support the bar and keep it in place. So now we don't have that strain on the wrist anymore. So there's some of the reasons you might want to think about hand positioning, particularly if you're presented with an individual who's coming in and saying, I have a history of medial elbow pain. So it'll be called golfer's elbow if they've spoken to their physio. So if you're someone who has golfer's elbow, that's something that's worth considering, or any powerlifter with a history of elbow pain who's really struggling to squat at the moment. They're some of the things you might want to think about. Right, now, so you know how to hold the bar, you've sorted that out. Next thing we want to have a think about is the actual position of the spine as we begin to squat, okay, and the breathing that is associated with that, okay. So, Paddy, if you stand out here for me for a moment, right, just as you are, that's fine. Now, what some people will do when they begin squatting and you tell them to, tighten their back, they mightn't worry about breathing at all, and all they'll do is they'll just arch their back lots, okay? And they think that's just supporting them. So they're not thinking about what's going on at the front here at all. It's just all at the back, and they're tightening up everything here. Now, this isn't necessarily harmful or anything, but what it can do, guys, is it can leave you in a bit of a weaker position, because as these muscles, the spinal erectors, they're all short shortened now in this position, and they're going to fatigue much quicker when we get to the bottom, and they have to do a little bit more work, and as we continue to progress on the set. So if you're finding that someone has their lower back is doing like so much work during the squat, have a look at the spinal position. If they're starting in lots of extension, it might be that those muscles are just fatiguing a little bit earlier because they're shortened, but also because you're not using the rest of your trunk muscles, okay? This can also be a cause sometimes of people not being able to get down low, because if you are doing this, exactly, Paddy's limited now at a shorter position, because if you stand up again for me, Paddy, and arch your back hard, if you take a look at what that looks like from the side, it's almost as if he's flexing his hip a little bit already, because by virtue of anteriorly tilting that pelvis, that's the same as him actually flexing his hip just a little bit. So if we've taken 5 to 10 degrees of hip flexion away from him before he even begins the squat, then what will happen when we get to the bottom is he's going to be cut out a little bit earlier, because some of that range of motion has already been used. So that's something that's worth considering with the spinal position. So rather than trying to really exaggerate that extension, rather what we're going to do is get Paddy to take a deep breath in. Good man, and then brace everything tight around there. Okay, so rather than really exaggerating the extension, he's taking a deep breath in, taking a small, literally 2% breath out, and tightening everything up. Okay, because as you do that little bit of a breath out, it helps you to lock in that Valsalva maneuver. So you're basically bracing against a closed glottis. It basically means you're like locking up your throat, and then that's really going to increase all that intra-abdominal and intrathoracic pressure. Because basically what we want, guys, is we want all those muscles at the front, the rectus abdominis, the transverse abdominis, the obliques, etc. We want those to be contracted hard, and what that does then, especially as we begin to contract all the back muscles as well, is it creates this cylinder within Paddy's trunk, and this cylinder, when it's filled and it's like compressed gas, okay, especially as he's breathed in, so the diaphragm is pushed down, he's got his pelvic floor muscles at the bottom are tight, he's got his back for support, and then he's got his front muscles for support. We've got this compressed chamber now you could think of it as a compressed chamber of gas, and as you begin to compress gas, the amount of pressure actually begins to increase. So when we have more pressure, this trunk is now really stiff, it's really rigid and robust, and it's not going to just fold over under the bar. So now once he's got his hands, his shoulder blades, his trunk, everything is locked in tight, we then know that when our client begins to squat, that all this, it's all taken care of. Everything's stiff up here, and we can let the lower body do the movement and have that efficient force transfer between the lower body and the actual bar. Because if you do not do this and you're real kind of unstable around the midsection, you're going to find that you get a little bit of force leaking, you know, so there's going to be this movement at the upper and lower spine, and you might find you're folding over a little bit more, and that's just inefficient force transfer. So guys, with all that said, let's see a couple of reps here, Paddy, your normal kind of setup that you're going to do, and then we can start to point out some of the other variables that you guys might want to be thinking about. Okay, so as I'm coaching an individual through the squat, you know, I'm looking at all those variables, and I'm also looking at like the relative angles between the different joint segments. Okay, so one of the things I'm kind of looking out for is what's his lower back and his pelvis doing, that lumbopelvic region, what's that doing as he gets to the bottom of the squat? So if you take a pause down the bottom for me, Paddy. So normally what you're going to see is you want to see like relatively flat from top to bottom. There can be a little bit of butt wink, of normal kind of flexion of the spine and a little bit of posterior pelvic tilt at the bottom. That's relatively normal, and when you look at studies that are carried out on this in terms of measuring it, it seems like that's a relatively normal part of squatting, regardless of whether or not you intend to do it. But this can get to the extreme, so if you do a real rounding for me at the bottom, Paddy, in this case, we've lost a lot of tension through this back because his pelvis is basically tucked under there, and now he's lost all that tension that he developed through the back and also through the hamstrings and the adductors. So you can stand up again for me, Paddy, good man. So if we think about what's going on here, right? So his hamstrings at the back, the hamstrings aren't a primary mover in terms of the squat, but they are still allowing for efficient energy transfer. So if you've built up some tension in the hamstrings, and especially the adductors as well, the adductor magnus in particular, that's a very powerful hip extensor. As you lower down and you're flexing that hip as Paddy was there, what's happening is you're building up some tension in those hamstrings and in those adductors. But if you then get to the bottom of the rep, so if you come down into your normal squat, keeping the back nice and tight, so he's got tension here in these hamstrings and in the adductors. And as he lets the pelvis tuck under, he's lost that tension, and now he's going to have less efficient force transfer. You can come up again, that's fine. He's going to have less efficient force transfer through the hips as he's performing the squat. So that's obviously not desirable if we're trying to get the most out of the actual exercise. We don't want to be getting weaker again at the bottom, okay? So have a look out for that. Try to, you know, get your clients to actually keep a more or less straight back, but recognize that if there is a little bit of movement here, it's not the biggest deal, but we do still have the intent to keep everything nice and straight. So as you look at the hip and the knee as you come down, so you can do it on the ref for me, Paddy, and pause there, good man. He's coming down to the point where, right, we've got nice, good degree of hip flexion. We've also got almost full knee flexion here. And we see that the knee is trailing over the front of the toes. That's fine. And the heel is on the ground as well throughout. So in general, you are going to see the knee traveling forward, traveling in front of the toes. That's absolutely fine. But what we don't want is that the knee's going so far forward that Paddy's knees are now starting to cave in and his ankles are rolling. So we don't want to see this position where the ankles are rolling and he's coming up onto his tippy toes, because again, we're getting inefficient force transfer there. So what I'd say to him there, if you come down to the bottom to that bad position again, Paddy, so he's losing his stability, what I'd want to say there, okay, Paddy, knees out onto the outside of your feet and then stand up nice and tall. Good man. You can rack the weight there for a minute. So the foot position there, guys, important thing to look at. Sometimes what you'll find is that your clients could have been squatting for years and, you know, their knees might come in a bit and the feet might come in a bit, and that's absolutely fine. It's not something that you need to be like really aware of in terms of correcting in everyone. But if it is very obvious that the person's losing their stability, they're getting weaker at the bottom, then one of the cues I do like to use, even from the start when we're standing up, is if you stand for me, Paddy, as you are, I want you to think now about screwing your feet into the floor. So what he's doing there is he's actually screwing in such a way that if you can see my feet here, that if you're kind of normally standing with your weight more so on the inside of your feet and your knees are just resting, what I want you to do is think about rotating your knees outwards, so that my knees are just pointing slightly outwards now. My weight is shifting to the outside of my feet, and that gives me basically this external rotation torque into the floor, because I'm trying to screw in. So now my hips are engaged, my knees are pointing out just slightly, so that when I start that squat, then my knees already have that tracking, because I've set that tension in, I've got that torque, boom, boom. Whereas if I just kind of go here, you know, my knees are less stable, but if I already had the intent to screw in, they're locked in place, and that's just solid from there on. So that's, you know, your hand position, your elbow position, your shoulder position, you're thinking about the spine, you're thinking about the hip, you're thinking about the knees, you're thinking about the feet. And as a kind of a rule of thumb, in general, your knees are generally going to follow your hips and your ankles. So if you are, or your hips and your feet in general. So if you are kind of using that rule of thumb there to screw the feet into the floor, put the weight to the outside of the feet a little bit, you're generally going to find that the knees will be in a relatively good position throughout the squat. Because if we think back to our kind of degrees of freedom discussion, recognize that the knees don't really adduct and abduct very much. So when you start to see these big movements like this, they're generally coming from a combination of the hip moving in and the ankle moving in, along with a little bit of rotation at the knee and a very little amount of adduction as well. But it is really a case of trying to set the hips, make sure the hips are ready to do good work, so you're externally rotating slightly, feet are locked in a solid position on the floor, and then the knees are generally going to be in a good position thereafter. And then the thing I would finally look at, obviously there's so many things you could change here, guys, but just the kind of basics that will apply to most clients. If you do just maybe 2 or 3 reps for me there, Paddy, what I want to look at now is basically his bar path. So as we look from the side here, guys, we can start to get an appreciation for the way that his body is varying in position. So this bar path, I want it to be more or less a straight line. Now, if it's an inch or two forward, an inch or two back, really no big deal, but it should be more or less a straight line. Now, with that said, you can pause for a second. You can have a straight bar path and still have a kind of a poor squat. So if you do kind of a squat morning for me there, Paddy, So what you can see there is that the bar path actually didn't move that much, right? So he's keeping the bar over his foot more or less, but he's allowing those hips to really fire back, okay? So what we want to look at, guys, is we want to look at the bar staying relatively over the middle of the foot throughout the squat. That tells us that someone is well balanced, they've set up their squat well, but we also want to see that the chest and the hips are rising at more or less the same time. So what you'll see is the chest and the hips elevating at the same time. That tells us that someone is really in control of their squat, as opposed to someone who's doing, you know, a squat morning type of movement where it's initially the knees, but then it's the hips to follow. So you can rack it there, Paddy. So guys, they're most of the things that I and Paddy as well, when we're coaching clients through the squat, that they're the things that we'd be starting to think about. Now there are of course additional things that are worth considering. People will vary in terms of their segment lengths, and as a result that might change the actual squat that you're presented with. So do play around with different tools, such as adjusting the position of the bar on the back, adjusting where someone initiates the squat. So for example, in most cases, like Paddy's there, you know, we're breaking at the hips and the knees at roughly the same time. So the hips are flexing and the knees are flexing at the same time. But you could have a focus where the hips are more so breaking first and then the knees follow. Some people like that. And then if you're doing like a front squat or an Olympic, a weightlifting type squat, you'll generally see that they really let the knees shift forward a lot and then the hips kind of follow thereafter. So they're not good or bad things. They're things you can play around with, and that's obviously the role of a personal trainer, is to try to personalize it and build a squat for the individual. Other variables include heel elevations, so you can elevate the heels, which then allows you to have more of that forward knee travel, because what we showed you there was that when Paddy got to the bottom and he shifted onto his tippy toes, that was basically due to a limitation in that ankle dorsiflexion range of motion, because if he doesn't have enough ankle dorsiflexion, what's going to happen is he's going to roll onto the forefoot, okay? So if we're able to elevate the heels a little bit, we can then replicate having more ankle dorsiflexion, and that can generally allow for a little bit more of an upright squat as well. So that's most of what you want to consider, guys. And the only other thing I would say to you is that do think of the squat in terms of, 3 dimensions. So we're not just looking at a side-on picture. I'd also like you to think about how this is affected from the front or in different planes. So although we're kind of thinking that the squat looks like this from the side on, we also want to consider actual stance width, So if you take someone that has a really wide stance, if it's really exaggerated, then that can generally allow them to stay a little bit more upright. So I'm staying quite upright there as I do that squat. But if you look from the side here, guys, at me doing that squat with an exaggerated wide stance, what you'll see is that my femur, it actually looks shorter because I'm adjusting the plane. Okay, so I'm now moving more in that frontal plane rather than the sagittal plane, with my knees moving out that way, okay? And that basically gives the impression of having a shorter femur and allows you to stay a little bit more upright, okay? So it is a three-dimensional movement. They're the types of things that we'll discuss in more specific videos, but just do remember that you do have those variables at play as well, and that we're not just looking from the side on. But that's most of what I would like you to be aware of when you're starting to coach the squat and think about how it applies to the individual. But as always, if you have more questions about specific squat videos, do let us know and we'd be happy to put those together.